There comes a moment in every seeker's journey when the walls of tradition begin to feel a little too close, when the answers that once comforted suddenly create more questions than they resolve. You start to sense that something essential has been missing, not because spirituality is flawed, but because it has been framed in a way that keeps you dependent instead of liberated. Alan Watts would say that many institutions are designed to point toward the divine, yet unintentionally convince you that you are separate from it. And separation, he believed, is the first illusion you must break. From a young age, countless people are taught that spirituality is something handed down by authority, written in books, recited in rituals, approved by leaders. But Watts reminds us that true spirituality is not an external system. It's an internal awakening. When you rely on others to define your connection to the divine, you give away your most sacred power, awareness. The truth that many do not speak openly is that spiritual freedom begins the moment you stop seeking permission to be connected and start realizing that you already are. Churches, historically, have played an invaluable role in guiding generations toward meaning and morality. Yet, when any institution becomes a gatekeeper of truth, the seeker becomes dependent rather than empowered. Watts often compared this to mistaking the menu for the meal, believing the symbol is the thing itself. If you only read about truth and never experience it, you become spiritually hungry in a room full of sacred food. The walls of doctrine can become both shelter and prison. Spiritual freedom, in its purest form, is your ability to discover the divine without fear, without guilt, without needing the approval of an external authority. It's the moment you look within and realize that consciousness itself is sacred, that you're not separate from the universe, but an expression of it. This is the truth that can unsettle institutions built on hierarchy. Once you remember your power, you no longer need intermediaries to translate God for you. You become fluent in the language of your own soul. And so, if you're watching this now, perhaps something inside you has already begun to stir, a quiet knowing that faith is not obedience, but awakening, that the divine does not live behind pulpit or robe, but in your breath, your awareness, your very being. Alan Watts didn't ask you to abandon tradition. He asked you to see beyond its boundaries. Because the moment you dare to explore what lies outside the walls, you discover that spiritual freedom was never forbidden. It was simply hidden behind fear. From the moment many of us first step into a religious institution, we are taught that the divine exists somewhere outside ourselves, above the clouds, in Scripture, in the hands of chosen authorities. This creates a subtle but powerful dependence. If God lives out there, then someone else must interpret him for you. Alan Watts warned that this idea fragments the self. It convinces you that you are spiritually incomplete, always lacking, always in need of guidance. The paradox is that in looking outward for salvation, you drift further from the sanctuary within. Over time, this dependence becomes comforting. It removes responsibility. If someone else holds the truth, you don't have to face the discomfort of searching for it. Watts argued that this dynamic can turn spiritual awakening into spiritual obedience. You follow rules not because they resonate with your soul, but because you fear the consequences of questioning them. And fear, he would say, is the enemy of awakening. The moment fear enters the heart, curiosity dies, and without curiosity, no one truly grows. As you age, you may notice a gnawing feeling, a spiritual hunger that sermons alone cannot satisfy. You might feel guilty for questioning, as if doubt itself were sinful. But Watts believed doubt is sacred. It is the crack in the wall through which light enters. When you stop blindly accepting answers, you begin experiencing them. Realization replaces repetition. This shift threatens any system built on authority, because an awakened mind no longer needs permission to connect with God. The truth most institutions struggle with is simple. Once you discover your own spiritual compass, you become ungovernable, not rebellious, but sovereign. You begin to understand that morality comes from consciousness, not coercion. Love becomes your teacher. Compassion becomes scripture. You don't abandon community. You simply stop outsourcing your soul. The leaders who truly embody wisdom celebrate this awakening. Those who fear losing power attempt to suppress it. And this is the first step toward spiritual freedom, realizing that dependence is not devotion. A true teacher points you back to yourself, not to endless intermediaries. What would smile and remind you? The finger pointing to the moon is never the moon. Don't worship the pointing. Look up. Fear has always been a powerful tool, especially in religion. Fear of punishment, fear of eternal consequences, fear of divine disappointment. When fear is baked into faith, obedience becomes emotional survival. But Alan Watts emphasized that a God who must be feared to be followed is not a God of liberation, but of control. When your connection to the divine is rooted in terror, you are chained, not guided. Fear doesn't purify, it paralyzes. Imagine a parent whose love is conditional, given only when you behave correctly. Many have been taught to see God through this lens. You feel watched, evaluated, graded. Mistakes become moral catastrophes. But what's taught that the divine is not a cosmic judge? It is consciousness itself, playful, curious, endlessly forgiving. Fear narrows the mind. Consciousness expands it. To awaken spiritually, you must ask, who benefits from a frightened believer? Fearful people follow, without questioning. They obey doctrine even when it contradicts their intuition. They silence their inner voice to avoid guilt. Watts argued that guilt is often manufactured to maintain structure. It turns natural human curiosity into taboo. It makes you afraid to think. And when thinking becomes dangerous, freedom dies quietly. The tragedy is that many confuse obedience with virtue, never realizing that true morality blossoms from awareness, not fear. But when fear dissolves, something extraordinary happens. You discover that your conscience is wiser than any rulebook. Compassion becomes instinctive. Integrity becomes effortless. You stop avoiding sin and start cultivating consciousness. Watts would say that enlightened behavior doesn't come from fear of punishment. It comes from recognizing your unity with all things. When you see yourself and others, you naturally act with love. This is why spiritual freedom frightens rigid institutions. Because when you shed fear, you stop being controlled by it. You don't need threats to behave well. You don't need shame to stay humble. You don't need guilt to be good. You simply awaken to the truth that you are not separate from the divine. And once you taste that freedom, no threat can scare you back into chains. As you continue to awaken, you begin to realize something unsettling. Many spiritual structures are built like boxes. They offer answers to every mystery, doctrines for every doubt, and definitions for every divine encounter. At first, this provides comfort. Life feels ordered, predictable, safe. But Alan Watts warned that when belief becomes rigid, curiosity dies. You stop exploring the vastness of your own consciousness and cling to explanations handed to you by others. And when mystery is replaced by certainty, wonder withers. This is how spiritual stagnation begins. Instead of asking, "What does this awaken in me?" you ask, "What am I allowed to believe?" And slowly, your inner voice, the one what's considered the true compass, grows quiet. You start to fear any thought that exists outside the box. You trade imagination for instruction. Yet, all sacred texts began as experiences of living, breathing human beings, not obeyers of systems. When you forget this, you worship the echo and forget the voice. Institutions cling to this box for a reason. When people question, they transform. When they transform, they evolve beyond control. Watts taught that enlightenment is messy, unpredictable, and deeply individual. It cannot be standardized. It cannot be graded. It cannot be tamed. True spirituality invites you into the wilderness of your soul, where no doctrine can map the terrain. In that wildness, you remember that God does not speak only through books. God speaks through intuition, silence, art, sorrow, laughter, and the pulse of your own awareness. The tragedy is that many confuse safety with truth. They believe that to question is betrayal, to doubt is rebellion. But Watts would argue the opposite. The moment you stop questioning is the moment you stop growing. Certainty builds walls. Wonder opens doors. Meaningful faith is not found in clinging to answers, but in dancing with mystery. When you step outside the box, you don't abandon spirituality. You rediscover it. Eventually, You realize that the box was never protecting you. It was protecting itself. And as soon as you step beyond its borders, the world floods with color. You don't lose God. You find God everywhere. In breath, in nature, in consciousness, in everything you once overlooked. One of the most powerful illusions taught within many traditions is the idea that you are separate from the divine. God is there, and you are here. But Alan Watts insisted this division is the root of spiritual suffering. When you believe you are distant from the divine, you become desperate to earn closeness through rituals, rules, or repentance. Your relationship with God becomes transactional, and your spirituality becomes performance. You chase what you already are. Watts compared this illusion to waves believing they are separate from the ocean that carries them. A wave is not something the ocean has. It is something the ocean is temporarily. Likewise, you are not something God watches. You are something God is temporarily. Consciousness expressing itself in human form. When you grasp this, fear dissolves. You stop trying to earn love and begin to recognize yourself as love. Yet the myth of separation persists because it creates dependence on mediators. If you believe the divine is unreachable, you must rely on structures to reach it. But Watts argued that enlightenment is simply remembering the divine is not out there. It is the awareness looking through your eyes. It is the silence behind your thoughts. It is the presence you feel when the mind grows quiet. No institution can grant this. They can only guide you toward it. Once this truth sinks in, everything changes. You stop worshiping from a place of fear and start living from a place of unity. Your morality shifts from rule-keeping to empathy. Your faith shifts from obedience to participation. You no longer see God as separate from the world, but woven into every particle of it. And forgiveness becomes effortless, not because you ignore wrongdoing, but because you see the sacred behind the mask of the human. This realization is the key to spiritual freedom. Separation is the cage. Unity is the door. And once you taste unity, the illusion shatters. You don't become divine. You remember you always were. Hidden beneath doctrine, tradition, and ritual lies a subtle economy. The idea that salvation must be earned through effort, sacrifice, or allegiance. Many systems imply that you are spiritually indebted from birth, and only through adherence can you be redeemed. Alan Watts challenged this notion by asking, redeemed from what? If the divine is infinite love, why would you need to purchase acceptance? When spirituality becomes transactional, peace becomes a product, and the soul becomes a customer. And customers, by design, must always feel slightly unworthy in order to keep returning. This quiet economy thrives on insecurity. You are told you are broken, flawed, sinful, unaware that these messages are not tools for enlightenment, but mechanisms of control. The moment you believe you must earn grace, you hand your power to those selling it. Watts often laughed at this concept, pointing out that the sun does not ask permission to shine, nor does a flower beg for approval to bloom. They exist because existence itself is divine. You, too, are a manifestation of that same divine energy. Nothing to buy, nothing to earn. When you internalize unworthiness, your entire life becomes repayment. You apologize for being human. You feel guilty for being curious. You fear punishment for questioning. Watts warned that fear-based spirituality creates obedient followers, not liberated beings. It suppresses inquiry, demonizes imagination, and turns divine connection into a subscription service, renewed weekly with guilt. But guilt is not enlightenment. It is imprisonment disguised as humility. As you awaken, you realize something radical. You were never spiritually in debt. You were never separated from the divine to begin with. Watts insisted that salvation is not a destination, but a realization, the recognition that you are already woven into the fabric of God's consciousness. This realization frees you from dependency and dismantles the illusion that someone else holds the keys to your eternity. Your relationship with the divine transforms from negotiation into communion. And when this truth clicks, the spiritual economy collapses. You no longer trade fear for comfort. You no longer kneel from shame. You simply are, radiantly and unapologetically. Divine love stops being a wage and becomes a birthright. And finally, you stop paying for freedom that was always yours. One of the most overlooked traps within institutional spirituality is the belief that morality must be imposed from the outside. You are handed lists of forbidden behaviors, prescribed virtues, and rigid definitions of good and evil. From childhood, you learn that right and wrong are determined by authority, not awareness. Alan Watts argued that this external moral compass does not create wisdom, it creates dependency. When you suppress your inner voice long enough, you forget how to hear it altogether. In this system, morality becomes performance. You behave not because your heart understands, but because you fear consequences. You act good to avoid punishment rather than to express compassion. And something essential is lost: the internal compass that arises from empathy, presence, and consciousness. Watts believed that true morality emerges effortlessly when you realize your unity with others. If hurting another is ultimately hurting yourself, kindness is no longer a rule, it's a natural response. Rigid morality also breeds judgment. When rules replace awareness, you begin to elevate yourself by measuring the failures of others. Institutions can quietly reinforce this by rewarding conformity and condemning deviation. But what's reminded us that humans are not separate islands of good and evil. We are waves in the same ocean, shaped by culture, trauma, and consciousness. When you see this, judgment dissolves into understanding. Compassion becomes instinctive. The tragedy is that external morality can make you obedient, but not awakened. It produces compliance, not consciousness. You are taught what to think, not how to feel. But when you silence your own intelligence to follow rules blindly, you surrender your greatest spiritual gift, discernment. Watts insisted that the path to enlightenment is paved with inner listening, not external approval. Morality arises most purely when it bubbles up from presence, not pressure. And so you begin to trust your internal compass, the quiet voice that knows when something is loving and when it isn't, regardless of dogma. As this awareness strengthens, morality transforms from obligation into expression. You don't need rules to dictate your compassion. You feel the sacred pulse of life in others, and you act accordingly. This is the morality institutions can't manufacture. It cannot be taught. It must be awakened. Throughout history, countless institutions have claimed access to the one and only truth, presenting themselves as the sole bridge between humanity and the divine. Followers are encouraged to believe that salvation is exclusive, spiritual legitimacy limited, and eternal consequence awaits those who wander beyond the approved path. Alan Watts challenged this idea boldly. He argued that truth is not exclusive property, it is universal awareness. When one group claims monopoly over God, they do not elevate truth. They shrink it to fit inside a box. This exclusivity breeds separation. Instead of uniting humanity by what we share, it fragments us by what we label. Us becomes sacred, then becomes lost. Watts believed this was the origin of spiritual tribalism, a fear-based identity that encourages belonging through exclusion. But he reminded us that no authentic enlightenment can come from division. If your awakening requires someone else's condemnation, it is not awakening. It is ego in disguise. The irony is profound. Every sacred tradition begins with a moment of direct, mystical experience, an encounter with something vast and indescribable. Yet over time, institutions crystallize that experience into dogma. The original flame becomes a frozen statue. Watts often said that when you worship the finger pointing to the moon, you never see the moon itself. Exclusive truth tells you what to think instead of teaching you how to perceive. Instead of opening your eyes, it hands you someone else's description of what they saw. When you start to explore spirituality beyond boundaries, guilt tries to drag you back. You are told you are betraying truth by searching for it. But Watts would argue that truth itself invites exploration, because the divine is infinite, shimmering through every culture, text, and consciousness. To believe only one window lets God's light in is to misunderstand both the window and the light. Once you see this, exclusivity collapses. Truth becomes an ocean, not a cup. And here is the quiet revolution. When you release the illusion of exclusive truth, you free yourself from spiritual comparison. You stop measuring righteousness, ranking souls, or fearing those who think differently. You stop protecting truth and start discovering it. And discovery, what's believed, is the heartbeat of spiritual freedom. As you peel away the layers, dependence, fear, rigid belief, external morality, exclusivity, something begins to awaken inside you. A quiet, powerful realization. Your spirit was never imprisoned by God, only by ideas about God. Alan Watts insisted that liberation is not granted by external authority. It blossoms the moment you stop denying the truth already blossoming within. Spiritual freedom is not rebellion. It's remembrance. You are not breaking rules. You are breaking illusions. Freedom arrives subtly at first. The guilt that once weighed on your chest begins to soften. The fear of questioning dissolves. You start trusting your intuition with the same reverence you once reserved for sermons. You begin to feel the divine not as a distant ruler, but as the awareness breathing your life into existence. Your prayers transform into conversations, your rituals into expressions, and your faith into experience. You are no longer following spirituality. You are living it. And then something incredible happens. Your morality deepens without rules. Compassion becomes instinctive without punishment. You honor others not because you are commanded to, but because you can feel the same consciousness looking back through their eyes. This is what's meant when he said you are the universe playing hide and seek with itself. The moment you stop treating yourself as separate, everything becomes sacred. Institutions claim they fear chaos without boundaries. But the awakened spirit does not descend into chaos. It rises into responsibility. Not the responsibility imposed from the outside, but the responsibility felt from within. You care because you feel connected. You act because you recognize your reflection in everyone you meet. No dogma can create this. Only consciousness can. Once your spirit remembers, nothing can unremember it. And so you realize the ultimate truth concealed beneath centuries of structure. You do not need permission to be divine. You do not need certification to awaken. You do not need external approval to see God's reflection in your own awareness. Spiritual freedom is the moment you stop asking who is allowed to be sacred and start living as though everyone already is. Because they are, and so are you. As we reach the end of this journey, look back at every illusion we unraveled. Dependence, fear, rigid belief, borrowed morality, exclusive truth. Each one placed a brick between you and your own divinity. Alan Watts would say that the tragedy of the human condition is not that we are separated from God, but that we have forgotten we were never separate to begin with. Spiritual freedom is not rebellion against faith. It is the return to your own awareness. It is stepping out of cages built by minds who feared the magnitude of the soul. And now that you see the bars, they can no longer hold you. When you release the need for external validation, your inner compass awakens. You no longer ask permission to feel the sacred. The quiet voice within, the one silenced by years of doctrine and doubt, begins to speak again. It guides you not through fear, but through resonance. It pulls you toward what expands your heart, and gently pulls you away from what chains it. Watts taught that true wisdom arises from listening to this voice, because it is not ego. It is consciousness itself whispering through your humanity. And as you awaken to this truth, compassion becomes effortless. You stop judging others for how they seek the divine because you understand that every soul is walking through life with different lenses, different wounds, and different destinies. You realize that there is no chosen group, no exclusive truth, no spiritual hierarchy. There is only awareness, unfolding through countless eyes. With this realization, arrogance dissolves, and humility finally feels natural. You become a lighthouse, not a gatekeeper. So remember this: your spirit does not need fear to behave, guilt to grow, or chains to be loyal. It needs only awareness. You are not here to perform spirituality for approval. You are here to become consciousness expressed through compassion, curiosity, and presence. This realization cannot be given by any institution. It must be remembered from within. And once remembered, it cannot be forgotten. You are the ocean pretending to be a wave. You are divine awareness dressed in temporary form. You are free. If this message stirred something inside you, If it awakened a truth you've always felt but never had words for, share your voice below. Your comment may be the key someone else needs to unlock their own cage. Subscribe to stay close as we continue to explore what others fear to speak, and like this video to help this message reach the souls waiting quietly in the dark. Because once one mind awakens, the entire ocean ripples, and spiritual freedom begins with you.